at promoting the Jeffersonian ideals than Jeffersonians were. And I think a big part of that has to do with the embrace of the executive branch and executive power. And I think it's interesting when we're in a time where there's a lot of very interesting thinkers on the right, Dr. Hans Hermann Hoppe, Curtis Yarvin, and others that have talked about, maybe there's some benefits to monarchy over democracy, and some theoretical concepts in there that are worth visiting. Well, I think Jackson, I think DeSantis, I think these are examples of strong executives within a Republican sphere, and given the American tradition, that's important. And so I think that, again, there's some lessons here about what allows these people to be powerful. Because, again, when we think about all these people relocating, uplifting their lives, and coming to Florida, I don't know if that's the same thing. It's difficult to simply argue, well, the state is theft writ large, when you have people fleeing for the leadership of DeSantis, right? And so what makes him effective? And so I'm going to try to dive into that with today's talk. First and foremost, one of the things I think is interesting in this is that DeSantis is now being recognized as the most powerful governor in the history of the state of Florida. There's a quote from a legislator that there's a little bit of drama there, which I'll get into, but they said, no one wants to embarrass Ron DeSantis right now because he's basically where all the energy is within the party, but he's essentially now serving as the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Sounds pretty kingly to me, right? But if you aren't paying attention to Florida politics before 2020, a lot of you may not realize that there's supposed to never be a Governor DeSantis in the first place. This guy was supposed to be governor. This is a guy named Adam Putnam. Adam Putnam was a young Republican all-star back in the day. His family goes way, way back in the 1800s here in the state. He was elected to the state house when he was 22 years old. Went to Congress 4 years later when he was 26. When he was in Congress, he was perfect embodiment of everything wrong with the Republican Party. He voted for all the Bush's wars, voted for all the ridiculous spending. He voted for the dumb light bulb ban back in the day. He voted for cash for clunkers, right? If there's stupid legislation that a Republican supported, good chances are Adam Putnam supported it. Then he did what any person that wants to become governor will do in the state. He tried to seek statewide office. He became agricultural commissioner. There he crushed local small dairies to benefit large corporations, yada, yada, yada. And when he ran for governor, he was supported by 99% of the Florida Republican establishment. The headwinds that DeSantis had going into this race within the state of Florida were even greater than what Trump faced running in 2016. Putnam was also backed by the Florida Chamber of Commerce, which is going to be something I'm going to touch on more and more during this presentation. And at one point, this was June, Putnam was basically twice this amount of support that DeSantis had. But DeSantis had one big asset here. He had Donald Trump. 3 tweets from Donald Trump, and Ron DeSantis wins this primary by over 20 points. This is a shellacking that just doesn't normally happen in Florida politics. And he did so with, running a campaign. His entire thing was, I'm Trump endorsed. Right? If you don't remember the career of Congressman Ron DeSantis, I don't blame you. Not a lot of people will, right? But every single yard sign he had said Trump endorsed on it. His sign. He didn't run a particularly good campaign, to be quite honest. I supported him because I didn't like Adam Putnam. But this is everything. The only thing he had going for it, Ron DeSantis is a pure product of the Trumpany, and there's some value I think with it. Of course, he beat Andrew Gillum. It was a very, very tight race. There was, recounts involved. Down in Broward County, right? If you remember this, they were caught busing in fake ballots in this race. And basically, they were able to stop the supervisor elections in time to save that election. She was promptly removed the first week in office that DeSantis was in office. They ended up reaching an agreement there, but she was thrown out. Again, election integrity, that's a whole other issue for another time. But again, it was very, very close for Andrew Gillum, who then became famous for other things later on. And so again, there was an audit here where, again, this was pretty widely known. Again, all sorts of election integrity issues within the state of Florida. What kind of gave DeSantis that razor-thin victory was twofold. One of the things that was kind of surprising and perhaps shows the strength of the school choice agenda, particularly within states, is that DeSantis overperformed with Tallahassee black moms because they knew Andrew Gillum was opposed to school choice. And then he was also endorsed by environmental groups. because DeSantis made a big part of his campaign standing up against the big sugar industry, which is one of those large corporate interests here, which played out in the big deal within the Clinton race. What's interesting though is when DeSantis came into power, right? When you're a congressman entering a statewide office, particularly a state like Florida, big, diverse, very expensive media markets, he didn't have a Sherpa within to kind of guide him around, right? And Matt Gaetz, ended up winning big time by being one of the few people to actually endorse DeSantis. Which again, it's interesting just from an outsider sort of perspective there. Now, you hit COVID, and of course, Florida did shut down. At the beginning of April, DeSantis passed statewide rules banning certain types of businesses being open, yada yada yada. Enforcement at the local level was not particularly, independent of where you're at. There's a big difference where I'm from up in Bay County. The difference between the sheriff's office and some of the city police. So local enforcement, key to a lot of this stuff in general. But a big reason for this is DeSantis got pressured by the Trump administration because Trump's polling in Florida was cratering. And it's because there's a lot of Republicans in Florida that are older. These are the people that should have been concerned about COVID. I have a great aunt down in Miami. She just turned 95 years old. She hates taxes as much as any good ANCAP, but she was terrified of this because she's 95 years old, right? And so there's a lot of pressure placed on DeSantis. They end up opening up in May, so it was about a month-long lockdown relative to others. But there's also, I think, a big difference when you are a DeSantis with very sort of large cities, a lot of internal politics. It's a different dynamic than like South Dakota, where Kristi Noem never locked down at all. Tampa is larger in population than South Dakota. And at the time, particularly population density and things like that, there was all sorts of fog of war within some of this sort of stuff. And so the calculations that DeSantis had to make as the executive of a state like Florida are different than someone like a Kristi Noem. But one of the things that allowed him to do this is that he took on the science itself. He started reading people like Scott Atlas, right? Like the Indian doctor from Stanford, Jay, I'm not going to try to mispronounce his last name. He was surrounded by intellectuals that gave him a defense of his policies. And because he believed in himself intellectually that he understood this issue better than the CDC, better than Fauci, right? Better than the biomedical security state, a term that DeSantis likes to throw around, which I think his choice of language at times is also interesting. He only refers to the corporate press, never the mainstream media, those little things right there. I think this gave him strength individually to lead in a way that a lot of states didn't. And one of the things that, he was big on natural immunity early on. He defended college students' right to party last year, which I think is interesting.
That was awesome.
And of course, the response to this was predictable from the media. This is Rebecca Jones, who was heralded. I think even Forbes promoted her as like a whistleblower of the year in 2020. She claimed that Florida was doctoring its data numbers and misrepresenting deaths. This is, of course, a very effective attack plan, right? When Florida is performing so much better than the rest of the state with not having these lockdown things, you have to explain that away. The explanation, DeSantis is lying. He's corrupting the science. She accused DeSantis of sending police officers to intimidate her. Well, no, it turned out she was sexually harassing a student at the Florida State campus that she was working with. It had nothing to do with that, right? But the media loved her, right? She got more time on MSNBC than Adam Kinzinger did. It's pretty impressive. They gave this guy, who's a lawyer actually to the east, west of me, they gave him serious airtime when he was dressed up as a Grim Reaper sort of character. I think he's running for Attorney General now, which kind of shows the state of the Democratic Party. And one of the things that DeSantis did that could give us all pause was that not only did he open up the state from a state perspective, but he imposed upon political localization. He declawed the mayor of Tampa. He declawed the mayor of Orlando. He declawed the mayor of Miami that wanted to put in place status quo Fauciism. And he said, no, even though you're local government, you can't do this. It's interesting, there's actually some works on Mises about local government that I think is I'm not sure DeSantis has read any of these more obscure texts from Mises, but I think there's some interesting conversations here. But this is a big difference. This is what made the difference between Florida and Georgia. Right? Atlanta, you wouldn't know the difference between a blue state and a red state. In Florida, you did, because he declawed what local governments were doing. Now, of course, when it came to 2021, DeSantis's competition, the power centers that he was focused on were no longer government actors.